When most people plan on heading somewhere new, they think of planes, trains, or cars. But for hundreds of years, the main way to travel long distances was by boat. The first large passenger ship was built in 1831. It was a steamship called the SS Royal William and could hold around 150 passengers. But this is nothing compared to the biggest cruise liner in the world today, the Icon of the Seas, which has 4 times the volume of the Titanic. At max capacity, it can hold more than 7,600 passengers and crew. There's no doubt that these floating cities are a man-made marvel, but they're not the only massive ships out there. From container ships to aircraft carriers, there are several types of large vessels for different purposes. But what happens when they outlive their operational life? Well, nearly all of them end up in the sea.
Crews go in and remove everything valuable. They melt down some valuable material. And then the cheapest and easiest thing to do with the ship is just to tow it somewhere in deep water and sink it. And sometimes it's done for the purpose of coral reef making, to make an artificial reef that coral can grow on and fish could live in. And sometimes it's just done to get rid of the boat. And that's been the main trajectory of most boats that don't become reefs, that don't become diving spots. They just become ocean trash.
That's Daniel Stone, author of the book Sinkable: Obsession, the Deep Sea, and the Shipwreck of the Titanic. For several years, he studied shipwrecks that were sunk intentionally and those, like the Titanic, that met their end too early. There are an estimated 3 million shipwrecks lying deep below, according to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, better known as UNESCO. Stone says that as the climate evolves, more and more wrecks are being found in unusual places.
There are shipwrecks in cornfields in Kansas. There are wrecks in the deserts of Namibia. There was even a wreck found under the wreckage of the Twin Towers on 9/11 as fill that was built to fortify New York City in the early days of that city. So there are wrecks all over the world. At any point, wherever you are, you're probably not more than a couple miles from a wreck.
You might be thinking, why are some of these wrecks being found underground or on land? Stone says there could have been a river or a body of water in those spots in the past, or the ship may have ended up there due to human error.
A lot of wrecks, especially on land, happen when captains, some of them incapacitated, maybe drunk, got snagged on some rocks and the ship takes on water and everyone bails out. Other wrecks are just abandoned on land. A lot of the city of San Francisco is built upon old wrecks that were sailed to San Francisco for the California Gold Rush, abandoned by prospectors, and then crunched down and turned into fill that expanded the city northward. That's true with a lot of kind of old cities where people sailed boats looking for new lives and had no use for their old ships anymore, and they became wrecks under the foot of people walking today.
For many experienced divers, it's an adventure to swim through these structures, documenting unseen history or discovering new treasures.
One of the best preserved ships is the Calvin Coolidge that sank in the Pacific, that every day of the year you can still swim through and see soldiers' uniforms, their notebooks and diaries, some of the wine bottles on board, and the great ornate decorations on the Coolidge.
While there are thousands of interesting shipwrecks, there are only a handful that have gained widespread notoriety, one of them being the notorious Titanic. So what made this tragedy stand out from all of the others?
It's not the most unique ship. Ships had been built big for decades. Ships had carried rich people for a long time. Ships had been considered unsinkable, and they had been hitting icebergs for many decades before the Titanic. So what was it about the Titanic that made this one into this superstar wreck of all time? And I realized it's a weird quirk of math, of numbers. Basically, 1,500 people died aboard the Titanic, but 700 people lived. And it's those 700 that were mostly young women and children who lived another 50, 60, 70 years telling and retelling the story of the Titanic and where it went and what it did and every detail that just swirled around and around and around.
And let's not forget all of the pop culture adaptations. First, there was the 1955 film and book about the final night of the voyage, called A Night to Remember. Then, of course, there was the 1997 blockbuster hit Titanic, which is still keeping the story alive to this day. But most people may not know that the ship itself was missing for 73 years after it sank. It wasn't until 1985 that scientists found its resting place.
The Titanic today looks nothing like what it did when it sailed. And that's because most of it fell apart. The Titanic broke in two, we know, on the surface. The bow fell first. And by the time it hit the ocean floor, it was going almost 30 miles an hour. And it hit the floor almost like a missile and kind of exploded. There's still a structure to the Titanic, but not much structural integrity to it. So when you go down to the wreck site, as some people do now, what you see is kind of a pile of wreckage, two distinct piles, the bow and the stern, and 5 different debris fields, they call them, of different components and wreckage that have been strewn all over the place. And seeing exactly where all of that wreckage ended up helps engineers kind of reverse engineer how it all started and how exactly it sank on the seafloor.
Despite the fact that the Titanic looks nothing like its former self, the site has still drawn thousands of visitors. Sadly, this has led to the area becoming polluted.
People on the surface who have dropped things, people who have gone down with ballast of, heavy chains that drop them. So there's a lot more trash around the wreck site, especially padlocks, as we know, kind of lovers like to leave in special places. A lot of padlocks around the Titanic wreck site now, too.
While some wrecks, like the Titanic, have gained an enormous following, Stone hopes to shed light on others that have equally interesting backstories.
In 1911, the SS Waratah went down near Australia, and the Waratah is often considered Australia's Titanic. It's almost the exact same size ship, killed a lot of people in almost the same year. The Waratah has never been found and really has this cultural lore to it also. But the most ships that are sought after are the ones carrying gold and silver, and there's a lot of these too. The most valuable one is called the Flor de la Mar, that sank in 1511, taking gold from India and Malaysia back to Portugal. It sank near Sumatra in Indonesia and is believed to have been carrying about $2 billion worth of gold with a B. It's still missing. Many people have tried to find it, but no one has yet.
Who knows? Your next hobby might be unearthing shipwrecks filled with treasure. Whether that sounds interesting or not, Stone says these structures are fascinating pieces of history that each tell a different story. To find out more about this topic and our guest, Daniel Stone, visit viewpointsradio.org. Also, check out his book, Sinkable: Obsession, the Deep Sea, and the Shipwreck of the Titanic. This segment originally aired in 2022 and was written by executive producer Amira Zaveri. Our lead producer is Libby Foster. Our studio engineer is Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.